University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the international research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. The project is conducted in collaboration with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of their Art Seeking Understanding program. The following recording is from our ongoing series of regular online seminars, where members of our research network and other invited guests present and discuss ideas about the role of art and criticism in generating knowledge and understanding. To see previous seminars in the series, or to find out more about the project, go to www.aestheticcognitivism.com. Today's seminar features a presentation from our lead research team, principal investigators Elizabeth Schellikens and John Gibson, and lead researcher Guy Deman, discuss plans for the second 3-year phase of the project, including 2 sub-projects in the digital humanities and experimental psychology. So today we're going to just have a rather informal session, we thought. And given that Elizabeth and John and I secured this extension to our project with funding from the Templeton Religion Trust, and that's running from summer this year to summer 2027, that we just give you basically an impression of what we're doing and where we're at. Some things coming up, just we had so much great input during the first phase from everybody that came to the seminars and came to the workshop and corresponded in various ways, that we've managed to incorporate that into the application for the second phase, and that we've really used these ideas in kind of clarifying and fine-tuning our research questions and methods. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in due course. And then after Elizabeth and I have kind of talked through the thinking behind the project and some of the sub-projects that we're going to be working on, or are already working on, in fact, John is going to talk about a paper that we're authoring together, which the intention is to kind of like combine various strands of the work we've been pursuing individually into a joint project, and then we thought we'd open the floor for discussion, and that discussion can be very targeted questions on the idea that we're putting forward, or it can be about the project in general, or it can be suggestions for things that we should be thinking about, or people we should be knowing more about. So that's very exciting. So I'm going to pass the word to Elizabeth, who's going to just like talk us through the kind of philosophical background to the project.
Welcome everybody. Really nice to see you. I thought though that perhaps we might show that very short clip, the 3 or 4 minute clip from that was made by the Templeton at the end of the first phase of the project, first to give you a bit of a sense of the general themes, and then I can kind of pick it up from there, since we're now entering phase 2. Is that going to work, Guy?
That is definitely going to work.
Can we even think of a way of relating to art without relying or being influenced in any kind of way by the art critical knowledge that we've amassed, more or less consciously? What would it be like to have a relationship with art if art criticism didn't exist?
Elizabeth Schellikens of Uppsala University and John Gibson of the University of Louisville are leading a team investigating how the language we use to describe art determines the way artworks convey meaning. Art criticism, in their view, is far more than just reviews of exhibitions and concerts. It's the means by which insight gleaned from the arts is articulated. So art criticism establishes the cognitive power of a work of art, helping deliver aesthetic meaning to the audience.
How do works of art help orient us in thought and feeling towards the world? How do they help us engage in forms of self-articulation?
Our work is focused on the idea that the understanding happens within the aesthetic experience. And the way in which art criticism helps us do that is by giving us the critical vocabulary in which understanding becomes possible. Aesthetic experience is a kind of thought which can involve pleasure, it can involve feelings, it can involve all sorts of imaginative exercises. But that doesn't take away from the fact that aesthetic experience is, first and foremost, a way of relating to the world.
When we look at a work of art, we see all these extremely sophisticated forms of meaning. What's mysterious is that those forms of meaning usually cannot be read off the surface of a work of art. Nonetheless, we experience that works of art is suffused with these forms of meaning. Criticism helps us understand how we're able to do that, how we're able to see so much in these objects, like, for example, a painting that's really just a colored surface.
The project is a collaboration with specialists in the digital humanities using AI machine learning to track the evolution of key terms as they emerged in art criticism over decades of critical texts from a variety of sources.
The Digital Humanities Project will look at how concept clusters arise around certain works of art that have a cognitive value, that tell us something important about how these texts open up new ways of thinking about our ethical predicament, what it means to be human, what it means to know the world.
Very, very few empirical studies have been done on how art criticism actually operates. What the digital humanities gives us is a way of tapping into the archives and handle that enormous body of knowledge in an efficient way so that we can see when did people start using this particular term in relation to art. What we've focused on in this initial pilot stage are Beethoven sonatas. Of course, Beethoven is a household name for us, but as we've been able to establish, one of the first composers with which one starts using the term revolutionary to describe the art. Thinking of the term profound, that's of course a word we think of as fairly mainstream, but that has not always been the case. Our working hypothesis is that these terms and concepts leave their mark on the way in which we engage with art, what we see in art, and of course what we learn from art. What we're looking into is the way in which we can, from a philosophical but also an empirical perspective, better understand how art criticism is part and parcel of the understanding and knowledge which art can yield.
Criticism is fundamentally a sense-making practice. And in making sense of works of art, great critics are making sense of the world.
Our goal is to strengthen the case for aesthetic cognitivism by looking at the philosophy of art criticism and the many ways in which art criticism operates in our engagement with art. And by that we mean not simply perceiving art, but also learning from art.
Good. Thank you very much for looking at that. And I think it's helpful in that it gives us a little summarized version of some of the things we were doing in phase one. And of course, picking up from what I just mentioned there in the video, as you know, the first phase was entitled Knowledge, Perception and the Prospects of Criticism. And this 3-year project is now Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. And the brief really is that we have is putting aesthetic cognitivism to the test is the idea. And of course, the project will encompass very strong historical and also empirical elements. We'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. But the core thinking remains fundamentally philosophical and philosophical exploration of cognitivism in the arts and aesthetic cognitivism. And as many of you know already, we take that claim to, it's in a fairly strong sense. It's not in the weak sense that there can be cases where art can lead to some kind of learning or knowledge, but rather that cognitive activity that we're going to try to describe is inherent to what aesthetic experience fundamentally is, and really must be part of an adequate explanation of why we value our aesthetic lives to the extent that we do. And so an important axiom for us, and I think share this with us, is that it's not philosophically productive to adopt a very neat or strict distinctions between the cognitive and the aesthetic dimensions of art. Of course, you can cash that out in different kind of ways. And some of you will know specifically what the three of us think through our publications. But we aim to show, of course, that aesthetic experience is really kind of shot through, as we say, with various kind of cognitive processes. And so we talk about knowledge. We also talk about understanding and insight. We talk about different kinds of understanding and different kinds of aesthetic understanding. And we talk, of course, about gaining different kinds of perspectives on the world through engaging in aesthetic experience. So two concepts that some of you will be familiar with also from the first phase of the project, our publications that are central also moving forward. This idea of cognitivism is the making sense, the sense-making claim that you mentioned a moment ago, and John will talk more about, but also this idea of coming to, seeking kind of understanding. And those two notions are notions that we want to explore further and that we want to really put to work in what it means to say that defend an aesthetic cognitivism. So as before, we're building on the idea of art criticism and the idea that critical practices around art isn't only, if you like, the object of philosophical reasoning, but also a living practice. And of course, we all know that art criticism can look, can have many different can come in different kind of guises and shapes and forms, and that's of course a challenge for us. But at the heart of our idea is the thought that art criticism isn't best understood in terms of a function, say the description of an artwork, or a kind of evaluation or a kind of interpretation that is somehow performed on an artwork, but rather that the art criticism interacts, if you like, with the artwork that it is about, fundamentally affecting our sense of its meaning, of its content, of its value. So we would say that art criticism provides a means of making sense of artworks, whereby the aesthetic and the cognitive value of the artwork is really realized. So it's not, again, telling us about something that is entirely separate from the art criticism. It's actually producing and giving in that way. And we talk of art criticism being reason saturated and again, sense making. So in this next phase, we are of course developing the empirical aspect, and we are really like widening the digital humanities aspect. And Guy will tell you more about that in a minute. But if you're going to come away remembering anything about what we intend to do there, perhaps this is the best way of putting it, is that our working hypothesis is that the cognitive and the perceptual pathways which we employ or which we kind of exercise in aesthetic experience or engaging aesthetically with art have in large part been shaped by art criticism. So that the conceptual and perceptual pathways that we have really kind of in a way determine the nature of our aesthetic experience. And that access to good art criticism is crucial to the intensity, the cognitive and the emotional depth that we tend to feel when we or experience when we engage with at least some artworks. So we think that this approach has various advantages. I'll just name a couple. One is that it's a more accurate reflection of the way in which we want to take art criticism to be a living practice, if you like, or kind of a set of critical practices, is a more adequate or accurate description of what criticism actually looks like. We know that it's not all about writing 600-word reviews in various daily newspapers, right? And I think it also offers, or kind of opens up for a less kind of oversimplified way of understanding how we best kind of also relate to criticism insofar as thinking of standards of judging our criticism to be good or bad. That's very, very brief, plenty more to say. But I think I'll pass the word on now to Guy, who will tell you more about the different aspects that we've touched on and started with, of course, in the first phase of the but are now like taking on in a bigger dimension.
Thanks very much indeed, Elizabeth, and thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the film. So, as Elizabeth was saying, we're kind of putting forward our thinking about art criticism, not just from the point of view of developing a philosophy of art criticism appropriate to the claims of aesthetic cognitivism, but also really thinking of the practice of art criticism and its long and rich history, really as material to make use of in trying to strengthen and defending the claims of aesthetic cognitivism. So one of the things that struck us is that a lot of the momentum in anti-cognitivism about aesthetic experience and about art tends to take the form of saying, well, if artworks are so productive of knowledge, then please tell us what that knowledge is. And of course, one response to that is, well, we have like a record of rich and engaging and informative responses to works of art, which take the form of art criticism. So that art criticism is almost like a ready-made resource to draw upon. During the course of developing this project, we've kind of honed in on two different methodologies, which we think we can make use of to really strengthen this claim in different directions. One historical and one empirical. So, as Elizabeth mentioned, we have and as the video explained as well, we have a digital humanities sub-project, and that began in the first phase project with this study which we managed to do with our colleagues here in the Digital Humanities Center in Uppsala University, basically compiling 200 years of reviews about Beethoven's piano sonatas. And the aim of this pilot study was in methodological terms just to see whether this kind of thing is possible, what the technological issues are going to be, and what one can reasonably do with this kind of like mass data collection. And the results, and you saw a little clip in the film, were really interesting in themselves, and it taught us, certainly taught me quite a lot about changing approaches to our understanding of Beethoven's sonatas. And so what we're going to do in the wider project, which is already underway, the wider Digital Humanities project, is really just widen this focus and try and gather, not completely indiscriminately, but as much kind of historical, well, basically like arts reviews published in the English language in a range of different countries, covering really a period from the middle of the late 18th century to around 2020. So we're already underway with that, and I think we now have a database of over 500,000 entries, pretty much all so far from the London Times, because that started being published in 1784. So we're just really broadening that, and then we are going to be using much more sophisticated techniques than we used in the pilot, enhanced by machine learning to categorize and to really do this thing that we were describing in the film of basically focusing in on how critical terms are formed in relation to particular works of art, particular traditions, particular particular artists, and how those terms then become kind of nexus points for thinking and making sense of works of art in general. So the kind of the history of critical concepts in art critical writing is thereby shown to be something which really kind of doesn't, it's not just descriptive of works of art and the history of works of art, but it's something that really interacts with it. And so the aim is therefore to use these amazing techniques that we can make use of today to show how far that goes. So we'll be able to, for example, not just focus on individual terms, but to create kind of like a conceptual map showing how different concepts link to each other and then where they're distributed, both in time and in relation to what subject, which artists and which works and which traditions, and also which continent. So we'll be using studies from Europe and like sources from Europe and from America and from Africa and from Australia. And so the idea is we'll be able to get this amazing macro picture of how critical concepts are transformed over time and how that has an effect on the way we have and continue to make sense of our artistic experience. And that sub-project is ambitious, quite self-evidently. And the idea is really that's going to kind of like be an ongoing project. So even beyond the confines of our existing funding for the Templeton project, we're going to keep on growing this, hopefully, if we can get more funding, with a view to making a kind of publicly available web resource where anybody from philosophers to humanities researchers to artists and critics themselves will be able to use this as a kind of like etymological encyclopedia of critical concepts and critical language, so that you search for a term or you search for an artist and you'll be able to see how you'll be able to kind of like look at like snippets of writing where these critical concepts first started being used and how they were transformed over time. So we are very excited about that, and watch this space, so to speak. So that's one side of things, and we're hoping that will provide like a substantial backing to our philosophical project in general, as well as being a self-standing resource of, I think, quite self-evident value. And then the second methodology that we are looking at or making use of is in the developmental stage right now, and that's using the methodology of experimental psychology. And for that, we're going to be working with our partner, Professor Emily Holmes, who is based here at the University of Uppsala. Emily Holmes is a very well-known clinical and research psychologist who's worked an awful lot on visual imaging and the imagination and memory. And her clinical work is very much about post-traumatic stress and our ability to process imaging around that. So it's she's a fascinating person to work with, and she's going to be guiding us in our approach to the psychology study. And the way that is going to work is going to be in two stages. We're going to have an online experimental environment using one of the several internet-based psychology research resources that exist in order to access a largish population of participants who will, just to keep this very brief, be looking at an example of a piece of music, a poem, and a work of conceptual art. And what we will be comparing is the measure of the kind of like intensity of engagement, the affective dimension of the experience, and the cognitive yield, both as it relates to making sense of the work of art itself, so the participants' ability to make sense of sometimes rather tricky work of art, but also to see how that making sense translates into making sense of the world insofar as it relates to the work of art. If the work of art is about something, so we're going to be looking both at criticism's ability to potentially help people make sense of works of art, but also to see what extent it also succeeds in pushing that gaze further outwards towards the world. So that's will be the first experiment, and that's going to start running, I think, next autumn, and then the idea is in our third year, in the last year of the project, we'll be also designing a real world version of this experiment, where we partner with an art gallery and do a version of this. And thanks to Emily, we're going to be able to use some fairly sophisticated technology. So it's not just going to be a questionnaire-based thing. We'll also be able to monitor at a physiological level these kind of responses. So the comparison, those who have access to criticism and those who don't have access to criticism, is going to be the central focus. So those are the two sub-projects we are have under our general umbrella. And as I've said already, and Elizabeth mentioned, that the idea for the overall project is that these kind of like feed into and sustain the philosophical core of the project, but that they are also, we hope, independently valuable. Well, thanks very much for listening so far. I'm going to pass the word over to John, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the paper we're working on at the moment.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. It's nice to see you. I see a few people who evidently just avoided a hurricane by the skin of their teeth, so it's very good to see you in particular. Welcome. Yeah, I'll be brief. Where we are right now, it's an exciting moment for the three of us. So for the past 2 years, we've all sort of individually been chipping away at bits and pieces of this project. I come from philosophy of literature, so I've been mostly approaching it by way of a theory of imagination and meaning. Guy's grounded in criticism, and Elizabeth, of course, the aesthetic, and particularly working on a notion of aesthetic understanding and noetic account of that. And in November, so just after the ASA, we're going to come together and co-author a paper that will hopefully make all the work we've produced individually cohere in some triumphant manner. And we're excited to write that paper and share it with you eventually. So what I'm going to go over today is a line that should run throughout the paper we will write in November. Because I'm presenting it, it will say more about imagination and meaning than about the aesthetic, but after I go, Elizabeth and can fill that in, or Guy. So it's going to sound like me, but I'm quite sure that most of the claims I'm going to make are ours, right? And I'm going to read because I'm constitutionally incapable of being brief if I do not have a script. So I'm going to use a script and finish in 8 minutes, on the nose, I hope. And we're excited to hear any suggestions or concerns you might have about this argument. This argument really has to work for the project to come together. And there are a lot of moving pieces, as you can tell from what Guy just said. A lot's going on here that we have to bring together and turn into, in this paper, a philosophical statement of what the project has shown. All right, so I'm going to read. Hopefully I'll read well. So the first step in the account of aesthetic cognitivism that I'm working on concerns the imagination. The claim is that imaginative immersion in an artwork is often a matter of making present to reflection broader real context in which audience situates certain of the local features of an artistic representation. To give a very crude example, we know to read James Baldwin's fictional representation of a lynching in Going to Meet the Man in light of very real features of US history and culture. In this way, allowing our imaginative engagement with his fictions to lead us to altogether real cultural contexts. This identifies a kind of meaning that is central, we argue, to the experience and criticism of art. For the moment, it will suffice to characterize this form of meaning as what we articulate in interpretations that specify the real subject matters that artworks invite us to see explored in their abstractions, aesthetic forms, expressive structures, and fictions, as the case may be. Our account of this yields a workable sense of how we establish artistic aboutness. This term's very important to the project. With aboutness here understood as what we articulate when we account for the bridge between an artwork and the regions of actual cultural, political, psychological, etc. reality that an artwork appears to fashion into an object of cognitive attention. The idea is that before we can think productively about the cognitive value of art, we need an account of how extra-artistic reality can so much as be encountered in artworks that are fictional, fantastical, radically abstract, composed only of musical sound, and so on. That is, artworks of whatever medium and genre, which on the face of it do not even yield a literal representation of reality, yet still strike us as turning a feature of the world into an object of exploration. One of the attractive features of the form of aboutness, we elaborate, is precisely that it is medium indifferent and can apply to works of absolute music, abstract painting, just as easily as to a realist novel. So what I'm currently working on is a model that can account for the cognitive significance of such attributions of aboutness. One of these, that not all attributions of aboutness are interesting, of course. So under what conditions are they cognitively interesting? Here, Elizabeth, Guy, and I are entirely aligned in breaking with common practice in this debate and explaining how so will furnish a quick sense of why criticism is so important to the work we're doing at the moment. Most contemporary work on the cognitive value of art makes absolutely everything hang on what we find of cognitive significance in a work of art, or failing that, think of Greg Curry, in a consumer's mind in the wake of an encounter with a work of art. Often in a way we think that invite charges of an unflattering form of methodological individualism, sort of consider consumer, a reader, an artwork in absolute isolation from important cultural practices that furnish resources for understanding how something like certain forms of meaning and value can be produced, right? We argue that we cannot offer a satisfying defense of cognitivism if we approach the issue by considering either consumer or artwork in isolation from our critical practices, whereby critical practices we gesture in the general direction of the public social dimension of appreciation and interpretation. The sociality of this dimension, embodied in our various critical practices, allows us to identify forms of sense-making and indeed rationality that we will not see if we limit our attention to what we find in the interior of the specific work of art, as so much work in the field does. I've been guilty of that very much in the past. The subversion of cognitivism we defend can be called critical cognitivism, hardly a surprise there that we're going to call this critical cognitivism. And it's a defense of the cognitive value of art and not just of criticism, because it shows that our critical practices play a role in articulating and indeed realizing the cognitively relevant content of work, when such there is. Right? In critical traditions, we often see what we rarely, perhaps never, find expressly declared in a specific work: highly detailed, reason-saturated expressions of how the matter of an artwork bears complex forms of political, ethical, psychological meaning and significance. As consumers of art, we are constantly drawing from a reservoir of established ideas and expectations about artistic aboutness, often cooked into the very concept of an artistic genre, movement, or practice. And in those cases where a philosophical defense of the cognitive value of a specific work is possible, that reservoir will typically contain information of sufficient sophistication that such a defense is given the kind of rational support that entitles us to invoke a vocabulary of aesthetic cognitivism. The idea is that it's by situating ourselves in these essentially public critical practices that whatever happens in our private aesthetic encounters gets linked to established structures of reason giving and sense making, such that the total experience can be seen as including a cognitive element. That's why criticism is important. No, we're not denying that marvelous things can happen to you cognitively when you read a novel on the beach. But until it's linked to these social practices, we don't have resources for giving much of an account of it, certainly not one that's public and empirical. So this is not an extravagant claim. If we think back to a state of pre-academic innocence, most of us can recall encountering a now cherished work that we had initially experienced as, in effect, a mystifying question mark. We found the work thoroughly inaccessible, perhaps because it was an exercise in radical avant-garde experimentation in a medium with which we were unfamiliar, or just supremely weird. Yet once we came to learn something about the relevant genre, the artistic movement of which the work is an instance, or the standing projects of the author, we suddenly could see the work as shot through with sense, significance, and purpose. Our claim is that experiences like this tell us something about what happens behind the scenes of appreciation, not just in respect to challenging works of art, but most of it. Criticism, in the expansive sense we motivate, is that region of the art world that creates many of the resources we employ in such acts of perceptual and imaginative bootstrapping, acts that permit us to see in artworks structured forms of aboutness that often cannot be read off of their semantic or perceptual surfaces, yet, once made present to appreciation, are typically experienced as part of the content of artworks. So again, it's a claim fundamentally about what we find in works of art, not in criticism. Criticism helps us get there. In this respect, consumer, work, and criticism are all three implicated in a nexus that itself delivers the desired cognitive goods. Cognitive value of art really accrues to this relationship rather than just a specific one. This obliges us to identify the conditions under which critical statements of aboutness are interesting, and they very often are not, right? To put the idea at an airy level of generality, artworks are created and criticism is conducted in a cultural context. They're situated in, to use Danto's famous phrase, an atmosphere of art theory. That is a set of inherited ideas that include not only conceptions of the nature and point of art, but all those features of social and cultural reality that animate the concerns of art making and its criticism at a given juncture in an art world's natural history. Some of those concerns will be political, of course. Some will be psychological, spiritual, ethical. As social epistemologists often remind us, when looking at groups and the cultures in which they're housed, we often find what remains occluded if we look at solely individual expressions of belief, varieties of justification and warrant that are passed on through fairly reliable social networks of sense making. We argue that if we expand our view and consider what we find displayed across the expanse of our critical practices, especially as they coalesce into traditions that arise around specific sets of artworks, we will find many of those things we do not find in the interior of specific works of art: the provision of arguments, the giving of reasons, the making sense of those features of artworks that prompt the attributions of aboutness relevant to cognitivism. In this respect, our critical practices are the art world example of what social epistemologists call more or less reliable social networks of sense making. If this is so, the cognitive value of art turns out to be part of the rational scaffolding of the forms of intellectual and creative activity, sociality, that make the art world possible, and they are only in full view if we attend to our critical practices. It's through these practices that our understanding of and sensitivities to art are educated, coordinated, and turned into possibilities of shared experience. That's an important idea that's left out of a lot of the work on cognitive value, we think. And these practices, of course, are fundamentally critical in nature. This, we think, is an important point that has implications for a great variety of forms of value and significance we ascribe to art, well beyond cognitive value, which should help us make sense, for example, of ethical value too, and other forms of meaning. So at this point in the project, it might change, but at this point, ours is effectively a bottom-up model of art's cognitive value. We are interested in identifying how forms of understanding get elaborated in the exchange between artworks and the critical traditions that arise around them. That is, in the species of argumentation, reasoned disagreement, conceptual innovation, and philosophical discovery that are visible, if not in Hamlet, then in the great critical debates that play has prompted. Our model seeks to identify forms of rationality and sense-making operative in our critical practices, such that a class of statements of aboutness can be seen as generated in a cognitively respectable way. And this has very little to do, for us at least, with demonstrating that artworks are vehicles of justified true belief. In fact, at this point in our research, I don't think we've used the word truth or knowledge. Knowledge, yes, but not truth. Certainly not in the sense that would make an epistemologist excited yet. right? So the version of aesthetic cognitivism we defend is, at this point, it's fairly modest. But of course, a modest cognitivist, and there are plenty of them, should be able to see how they can lead our position to more ambitious destinations. We think that an account of the rational scaffolding that criticism provides all of this would be of interest to just about any imaginable defense of aesthetic cognitivism. A rich account of criticism and how we use that as a resource should be valuable just about any of the standing ways we approach debates on the cognitive value of art. I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Good. We now thought we might just open up a little bit for questions or comments. We've got more to say, as you can tell, but we thought we'd take a break there and see if someone wants to jump in. Petronella?
Yes, I'm. Maybe this is an obvious question, but with this idea that there's an interaction between art criticism and art, what happens with art forms? And of course, I'm thinking of dance, where there is no, where like dance criticism doesn't have that kind of status as other forms of art criticism has, and there are very few sort of famous dance critics. I think they are mostly American, and they are disappearing. And I don't think most people who work in dance really read that criticism. I like the relation seems to me to be rather different from in music or in painting, or I don't know. This is just a thought.
Well, thanks. I mean, it's an interesting perspective. We are not going to be looking so much at dance, as we mentioned. We're going to be looking at those three other art forms within the context that we're of the project. But I take that your point is that there can be differences between different art forms in terms of how criticism captures or the kind of relation it forms with the artwork itself. My sense is, but John, Guy, and others might have other things to say about this. The question about the status seems less relevant to me insofar as these things are kind of, go up and down in terms of fashion, right? And of course, you can have different interests, which make some kinds of art criticism, more pertinent to your aesthetic life than others. But I take it on board that there might be differences. Guy, John, anybody else? Do you want to say something here?
I like that question very much. We don't want to give an account that implies that works of art cannot have cognitive value unless there's academic critical tradition supporting them. An important term, I haven't thought about this seriously, but I'll float it, a term that sort of designates diminished critical practices, the word scene. So for example, I live in a city with a jazz scene that gets absolutely no critical or national attention. It's not that good. But there is the generation of what you might, there is a critical culture that can be very, very local that does a lot of the generating of ideas and understandings of the point and purpose of what's going on in that movement. It gives you some access to these ideas of aboutness that one can rely on. So again, it's our interest in criticism. It's not as an academic or intellectual establishment, but a kind of social activity, right? That's one has to look at to find many of the things that we're not going to find if we just limit our scrutiny of works of art to their interior, right? That will give us access to some of the resources, the social resources we need to be able to answer questions about what its point and purpose is, that will clarify its ethical or its psychological significance, things that start sounding like they might be of cognitive value. I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Karen, hi. Nice to see you.
Hi, great to see you. Thank you so much. It's a super exciting project, and I'm on board with, I think, much of what you say. I wanted to ask you about particular, I think, a really important aspect of the project. I mean, you say correctly, I think, that you want to think about art criticism as not as a practice about an existing determinate meaning of the work, but as part and parcel of the making of the constitution of the meaning and value of the artwork. So at least that's how I understood you. And I think it's a really attractive way of thinking about criticism. Again, is not just reflective of something that already exists there independently of it, but as part of the constitution of those meaning. And yet, sort of in my work on the rational character of aesthetic criticism, I have often been struck by the fact that critics are also, they must be answerable to the work. In that sense, I think that sort of the rationality of criticism is more analogous to something like theoretical rationality than to practical rationality. So critics, maybe like scientists, they need to, I mean, they'll be beholden to the work in a particular way. They're constrained by the work in a particular way, just as scientists are constrained by and beholden by, the structure of reality in a particular way, or in the same way that I'm beholden to, the fact that it's not raining here in Auburn today when I, judge that it's not raining today. And this is a little bit different from, sort of practical rationality. When I make up my mind about what to do, it's not answerable to the way the world already is, but rather to how maybe it should be or ought to be or something like that. So I think that criticism has an important receptive component. This is another way of putting it. It needs to be answerable to something that is independent of it. And I wonder if you agree, and if so, how you would reconcile it with, again, a dimension of your argument that I'm also on board with, which has to do with the fact that criticism, does not just describe something that exists independently of it.
Excellent. Good. I mean, I think this is super helpful. I'll just say, I'm sure others want to jump in, but I just want to say that you're quite right that, I mean, the criticism must be beholden to the aesthetic character of the object. This is not an exercise of, making up various kinds of, or like seeing different kinds of things in the artwork and thereby, making sense of it in that kind of, really kind of idiosyncratic way. There's got to be like a dialogue between the critic and the object. I couldn't agree more. I'm just going to stop there, although I have more to say, but would anyone like to jump in?
I thought we were just really, really good question, Karen. And as Elizabeth just said, we're absolutely not trying to advance an epistemically irresponsible concept of criticism. But I think a key point is one that John brought up, was this idea that so as you said, that John brought up, of the idea of a nexus. So you quite rightly say that critics are beholden to the work of art as a kind of like ground for a rational and sense-making process. The critics are also at the same time beholden to their readers, in the sense that they're part of, or beholden to the norms and terms of a discussion which is going on the whole time, as it were. And I think it's really helpful to think of it in the ways that we've been discussing with John. That really, instead of focusing kind of on artworks as kind of like discrete individuals, which kind of never change, and the work of criticism as being something kind of separate, and then individual subjects of experience again being like another unit, that it's better to think really of the kind of the chain reaction which gets set off when all these things are brought into the same like time space, so to speak. So nexus is a really good term for really understanding what the object actually is, and that it's fed into by the discourse of criticism, by the history of art, as well as the the particular constitution of the work of art in front of us. That of course has, you know, like a greater authority than everything else, because that's what guides our experience in the moment. That's what gives us our sense of like what's there in front of us. But everything else feeds into it and is kind of like brought into the point of contact. So I think it's very useful what you say, because it's a way of like as it were reminding that all these things are happening, and that any kind of like work of criticism is simply just part of that, and that remains bound by all the norms of rationality that we would want to ascribe to the practice.
Okay. Thanks so much.
I just want to add to that. I think all of us are committed to a kind of realism about this. And one of the tricks in making this argument is precisely not to go back to 1995 in the debates on ludic or constructive accounts of interpretation. It can easily seem like it's leading that direction. We're not interested. I'm not sure if that was part of what was animating your question, but again, the claim is not that meaning is generated by criticism rather than works of art, but that much like in the philosophy of language, to understand meaning, you have to, at some point, ground yourself in social practices and see them as producing many of the resources. We're trying to make a similar argument with respect to art, but not in a way that leads to a kind of irrealism or something like that.
But it's really good to take that with us and make sure that we're clear on that point. Ole Martin.
Thank you. I just wanted to expand the concept of criticism just a little. It's easy to think of criticism as being publications in the public realm, but a lot of criticism, and interesting criticism, actually happens when some works come alive, i.e. through the work of instructors, directors, and the rest who help work with an ensemble that makes these work come alive, and they really tap into the work that is there, but they also work in order to connect that work with the public. And so I think we need to be aware of criticism being a phenomenon that goes way beyond what you find in academic publications and even newspaper and other media publications, and think of gallerists, their importance in the history of art, and curators with exhibitions that home in on certain themes that then suddenly become more apparent to the public. So just my 2 cents. Criticism is a fairly wide and very important phenomenon.
Thank you. Again, an excellent point. And again, I don't know, I think, our project's fairly ambitious already. I don't know if we can include all the things we will mean, or one could mean, and could, importantly be thought of as criticism. But I think that's a really nice angle and something for us to bring in, not least when it comes to, since we are focusing on 3 art forms that are kind of performative and in that kind of way. So very good.
I just, because I think I mean, obviously perfectly right, Ole Martin, and it is actually a very important point. But I think one of the advantages of the account of criticism we're trying to generate is just that it is much more fluid. So it's a fluid account of the reach of criticism, as well as what's actually going on in relation to our experience and to the works of art and their meaning. And I think, even though for the sake of convenience, so certainly for the digital humanities study, we have to use kind of published material because that's what we have access to. But it's also like part of our thinking that this published, the published record of art critics, whether they're kind of university academics or newspaper journalists, is just simply like a formalized version of what we think of as a art critical conversation, which is going on the whole time, and as part of this kind of like social structure which anchors and informs the meaning and aboutness of the works of art that we engage with.
Good. We have 4 more minutes, and we know you're all busy and your time is valuable. I think we should perhaps move on to just saying a little bit what's going to happen over the next few months, so that you're on board with that. And then, we realize that we did ask you for 1 hour of your time, so we've got about a few more minutes. Guy, perhaps you could talk us through it.
Yeah, great. So in fact, that's a bit of a headline in the sense is that what we thought was very important is for the research seminars that we have on Zoom, of which this is the first, and thank you very much for joining us. We're really going to try and limit it to an hour because we know how busy everybody is, and also Zoom meetings, when they go on too long, do get they encourage a certain fuzziness of the head. So we want to keep it short and sweet, and we're really looking forward to getting this series going. And so in a few weeks, Peter Lamarck is going to join us, and he's going to be talking about some thoughts he has on aesthetic cognitivism. And he's, of course, well known as one of the main opponents of generalized thinking about the cognitive value of literature and art. So his thoughts are going to be very valuable. He was unfortunately unable to make it today, but he sends his best wishes to everyone and looks forward to seeing you on the 7th of November. And we're going to, as far as possible, try and keep these meetings scheduled for Thursdays, roughly every 3 weeks or so apart during term time, and around this time to allow as much as possible a transatlantic engagement, weather permitting, one perhaps ought to say. And then on the 21st of November, we're hugely looking forward to being joined by Cynthia Friedland again. Cynthia's here, and so she's going to be presenting on the 21st of November, and we're very much looking forward to that, Cynthia. Thank you so much. And on the 12th of December, I beg your pardon, we are going to hear from Elizabeth Camp, whose work on perspective in relation to cognitivism or aesthetic cognitivism is, of course, extremely well known. So that's our program for this autumn in terms of the research seminars, and we will be in touch fairly soon via our growing email list with details of what's happening next term in the same format. We've of course got a bunch of other things going on. I mean, we're all busy with the work itself, but we should be launching early in the new year a podcast. So you may, those of you who joined up with the seminars from 2022 to 2023, remember that part of the seminar structure was that we also featured interviews with some critics, and that also extended to artists in terms of the workshop we had in Uppsala physically in June 2023. And the idea is to formalize that structure, that we're going to have a regular podcast where we interview critics and writers and artists about this this thing which all Martin touched on, the sense that a great deal of what happens and what critics do is already present in the creative process itself. So there's going to be a pretty diverse series, and then keep in touch. We will update with publications and upcoming events on the website. We're planning to have a workshop in Uppsala beginning of next autumn, and then another larger conference at the end of the project. So thoughts and news and information about that will be emerging. But certainly for my part, and I think I speak on behalf of John and Elizabeth as well, it's just wonderful to see you all here again, and those of you who weren't here before but are coming now, and I very much hope you'll stay with us for the seminar series as it emerges. And thank you very much. Thank you for listening to this recorded seminar from the research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. To find out more about the project, please go to our website www.aestheticcognitivism.com.